All right, now we are one community, East African community, and when one of our neighbors is in trouble, it is our business. No wonder President William Ruto has been speaking boldly on what is happening in DRC. We followed closely what has been happening. We're looking at a number of deaths or lives lost, 700 thereabout. We're looking at people in millions who are in need of humanitarian assistance and aid, but cannot even have it as we are speaking. Now, if you look at the background, the DRC has been a nation in perpetual crisis, as I said earlier on, since the late 1990s. Now, if you look clearly, 3 major wars have been fought in the country. The first Congo War, October 1996 to about May 1997. The second, the Congo War, of course, that happened as a Great War, if you like, of Africa, 1998 to 2003. On record, we're having the third Congo War that began in 2004 in the Kivu region of the DRC, where we're expecting also then Natalia to join us shortly. But the question is, are we looking at a continuation of this war? Remember, in 2022, I believe former President Uhuru Kenyatta was involved in some peace talks as well. So is this another war? Is DRC back to war as we're speaking? Why? All right, and what could be the solution? I'm joined in studio by a very key mind on this matter, and I'm very honored to have you here, Dr. Edgar Kivua, who is an international affairs and a security analyst. I'm not sure if I should say good evening.
Good evening.
Is it?
Well, it's a good evening. Yeah. Let's make it a good evening.
All right, let's make it a good evening as we look at solutions.
Exactly.
But what would be your general remarks to what is happening, even as we're looking forward to this joint summit of the Southern African Development Committee and the East Africa Community that will be held over the weekend?
All right, thanks. So just to sum it quickly before we go into the nitty-gritties, the DRC problem is an issue about, it's an identity issue, okay? It's a security issue as well, yeah. So those are the 2 main things that I can pick up. It's an identity issue, it's a security issue. So based on how each of the parties views these 2 issues, the reactions that we have and all the attendant issues that have come out of it. So identity, security. I
want to hear from Professor Monda, who's joining us live in New York. But before I do, you have spoken on matters identity and security.
Yeah.
M23 rebels, who are purportedly, I mean, they're allegedly backed by Rwanda.
Yeah.
Rwandan President Kagame has said he has nothing to do with that. Those are Congolese people, and Rwanda has nothing to do with that. However, there's also a concern about matters minerals. So where did this lie? Security issue, identity issue? Are they protecting the minority, you know, the Tutsi, if anything is to go by, the M23?
Yeah, I mean, if you go into their history and reading into just how they've come up and how they were formed, M23, the Tutsi Congolese, originally in 2009, was supposed to be integrated into the DRC army. So there was an agreement to that effect, that they would be integrated into the army. And why integrate them into the army? So they would feel that years of marginalization and them being called, you know, like foreigners on their own soil, that they would be integrated into the country. So when that failed to happen, because again, also I can see the fear from Kinshasa feeling like we're integrating foreigners into our army. That's why I keep on saying it's an identity issue. The fact that the Congolese government has never fully accepted that the M23 and the eastern parts of Congo, the Tutsi-speaking, Banyamulenge, Banyarwanda, are actually Congolese. So that is where the identity comes in. Then, the fact that they are not accepted, it creates a security issue. The security issue now becomes when now they feel marginalized and there are other militias who are out to exterminate them or commit acts against, you know, humanity against them, war crimes, genocide. And also now, Rwanda comes in and says there are FDLR, rebels, militia in the country. So identity, security, this cyclic of these 2. Before these 2 issues are dealt with and are, you know, and people have honest conversations around them, we will keep on having this DRC issue.
Now, I want to just hear from Professor Monda, and I'm coming to you again shortly, Dr. Professor David Monda is a political scientist at the University of New York and is joining us right now. Professor, it's very good to see you again to talk about international matters, you know, and I want to just quickly go to your article that I believe you wrote in the year 2022, June 20th to be precise. And the headline particularly caught my attention. You said, why Kenya risks entering an endless war in the DRC. Professor, welcome aboard.
At the time, I wrote the article when Kenya was preparing to send the East African Security Force, to send its troops there as part of the East African Security Force. And I wrote that particular opinion piece from the perspective that the dynamics of the politics, the economies of what I'd call economies of violence within the DRC, how all these different, rebel groups are squabbling to control very strategic minerals. Kenya would be getting itself into a really complex situation. And East African Security Force troops left, including the Kenyans. And as you can see, almost 13 South Africans were killed, in addition to Malawians, and the crisis seems to be continuing. But I think, having said that, we really, when we look at this crisis, we really need to understand it from the perspective of the Rwandese and also the DRC. So Rwanda's main interests in the DRC are economic, their security, but they're also around Rwanda's use of the international system, both regional and international systems, to advance its own interests within the DRC. And President Kagame has used this element of transformational authoritarianism, right? So he sees himself in the model of, the authoritarian in Singapore, that he's going to use a strong hand to secure Rwanda. In addition to that is what Dr. Guido was talking about, the other element of Rwanda really using historical memory and blackmailing the international community around the genocide of 1994. So this idea that if you do not allow the Rwandese to secure their border, to actually commit incursions into the DRC, then you'll have the FDLR, which are the Hutu rebels in the DRC, moving back over the border and trying to finish the job. In other words, take back the country that they controlled prior to 1994. So the crux of my article was really to say the politics of the region of the Great Lakes is extremely complicated. And what you see on diplomacy, what presidents and leaders are actually saying in public, in many cases is very different from what they say in private. And in this case, we see Rwanda using the pretext of going after the FDLR, the former Hutu rebels, the Interahamwe, as a pretext then to commit incursions into the DRC through the M23 to secure massive volumes of gold, of tin and coltan, very rare minerals. So there's a lot of these other dynamics. And Uganda, of course, is also very much involved within the exploitation of the DRC minerals. And Uganda also going after the ADF, which is another rebel group that's threatening Uganda.
Professor Monda, if you allow me to also acknowledge Natalia Torrent, who is joining us live from North Kivu. She's the MSF Chief of Programs in North Kivu. It's a very dire situation, and if you can hear me, would just love to hear what the status quo is like. What is the picture like on the ground? Natalia, if you can hear me, they're saying so far DRC has become one of the largest internally displaced people's crisis globally. We're looking at millions, children and people alike. Could you create a picture for us, Natalia, of what exactly it looks like in DRC in as far as humanitarian support is concerned, and how it really, really looks like?
Okay, thank you. Actually, as somebody was already putting, this part of the DRC, the eastern part, the Kivus, it's in a conflict status since the late 90s, and actually the humanitarian crisis, it comes since the late 90s. And what we're seeing is that in the Kivus, it's a larger internal displaced population on the globe. We're talking about more than 5 million people displaced due to several conflicts. And it's true that in the last wave, the last wave of mass displacement is happening since the resurgence of the M23 movement that has caused several displacement and massive displacement population in the North Kivu. Right now, the situation, and not only these last days in Goma, because right now it's true that Goma is bringing the spotlight on the region, but the region has been suffering for huge humanitarian crisis since years, and especially in the last 2 years. Around Goma, right now, there is it was around 1 million internal displaced people living in camps in a very dire living conditions around Goma, and seeing that the combats and seeing that the front lines they were approaching them. And not only in the last weeks, but as well we saw an intensification last year. We saw that artillery positions were located close to the camps, and most of the times, not respecting the protection of civilians. We have seen that in Goma. We have seen that in other cities where MSF is also operating. So when we talk about humanitarian crisis, we see that the population has, besides living under the poverty line and being in a very vulnerable situation, forced to get displaced more than once, we see that they have problems to access to basic services as healthcare, and that's why MSF has been investing in providing healthcare around the North Kivu. There's population that, due to the living conditions, are very much prone to epidemics like cholera, like measles, like malaria, something that can be preventable, especially with vaccination campaigns. But due to the conflict, the kids are not properly vaccinated. We also see, and we have to provide medical care to survivors of sexual violence. And right now, obviously, when the situation and when the fighting gets closer to the cities, as we have seen in Goma, but previously we have seen in Masisi, we have seen in Minova, civilians are also trapped with those intensification, those conflicts, and we have seen that the toll among civilians these days in Goma, it's very high.
Very, interesting picture you're painting there, and I want to come back to you. And before I speak to Professor, Monda, just very briefly, Daktari, you've heard the dire situation, and it's not something that started this year. This is exactly what it is, and like you said, there's a security issue, identity issue. But what about the wars prior to that? There must have been other things instigating, or is it the same thing over and over again? And do you think this time the African nations could come to a conclusion that might be long-lasting, so that we can go back to Professor? He has, I think, an engagement after.
All right, yeah, I think that's a nice question. I mean, like Professor Monda has said, it's a very complex conflict. It will not be solved overnight, but the key thing that the African nations need to do, especially the summit coming up for EAC and SADC, is the political goodwill, the willingness of DRC and Rwanda to each respect each other's views. And in my opinion, number one, for DRC to agree to sit down and negotiate with M23, sit down and talk to them. Because M23 are Congolese. That is one fact that nobody is going to run away from, regardless of where their support comes from. These are Tutsis, these are Congolese Tutsis who claim they have a grievance. So any legit government, any government of goodwill will sit down and find out, okay, so what are the issues? And then they will spell out their issues, and then structured negotiations around that could occur. I believe that if Rwanda feels that the Congolese government is dealing with the M23 problem and negotiating with them, and also Rwanda's talking about the FDLR, who are now the Interahamwe, like Professor Monda said, within the Congo. If Rwanda is assured that FDLR will be dealt with, it will leave Congo and M23 to talk as Congolese, the Congo they want, and trust me, we'll get a de-escalation of tensions, and hopefully things could go back to normalization. It's not an overnight thing, but we need a ceasefire. We need political goodwill. We need good faith on both sides. Whoever is backing, whichever force needs to back off. I mean, I saw Romanian soldiers, mercenaries in DRC. I was afraid I would even see the Wagner group there, okay? At this rate, you might get the Wagner group or the Africa Corps from Russia inside there helping someone to fight. So let the foreign forces withdraw. That's true.
All right.
And then negotiation based on goodwill by both Rwanda and DRC and M23, and then we de-escalate the whole thing.
De-escalate the whole thing. Let me hear from Professor David Monda. Even just reading through your articles, Professor, do you think there's a long-lasting solution to what's happening? You thought then it would be risky for Kenya to join in. The issues of, certain financial strains at that time. What do you think it looks like? Do you think negotiations are a way to go? Do you think M23 would be willing to sit down? You heard South Africa's remarks on this matter. UK threatened to withhold its, billions in pounds aid to Rwanda, which means Rwanda could be an isolated eastern, nation. But I do not know what your observation is first in as far as getting a solution and how this might be playing out if negotiations is a way to go. Professor.
Yeah, unfortunately, and as an African, I'm sad to say this. I really don't see this crisis being resolved very soon. And I say that because what foreign players are saying in public is very different from what is going on the ground. We know there are a lot of US, UK, French, Belgian, companies, Israeli interests are extracting these minerals through some of these rebel groups. We know that President Kagame is promising to sit down and negotiate in South Africa, yet President Kagame does not trust Cyril Ramaphosa because he feels Cyril Ramaphosa is biased towards the DRC. And President Tshisekedi himself is not interested in speaking with the M23 because that will give M23 legitimacy. The minute he sits down and acknowledges M23 at the negotiating table, then that means M23 is a player. And let us not forget that there's almost 120 other rebel militias that are working within that region. And the other challenge with this, in terms of the humanitarian issues, creates incredibly difficult dilemmas. So when MSF or World Food Program's giving aid in Goma, you're not really sure whether you're giving this aid to refugees, to genuine people seeking help, or whether you're feeding the Interahamwe and the rebel groups. So I really think what needs to happen in South Africa is to reconcile two processes. The Luanda process, led by President Lourenco, that was a peacemaking process that allows SADC forces to militarily engage in the DRC, and the Nairobi process, which was led by former President Uhuru Kenyatta, which was a peacekeeping process. So East African troops could not engage directly and try and disarm rebel militia. There needs to be a reconciliation between those two, because MSF and World Food Program and all these other agencies that are doing incredible work in the Great Lakes region, they cannot do their work if people are killing each other, if their aid workers are getting killed, if there are lorries and their trucks going into regions where people need help, that those supplies are being stolen by these different rebel militias. And it will be really interesting to see whether President Kagame is actually interested in diplomacy, whether these are really talks or are they talks about talks. So by that I mean there's a diplomatic game here going on, where Tshisekedi will come to the diplomacy table and see, is a military solution from the DRC army able to push out these rebels? And Kagame on his hand will be really looking to see where is the international community? Can I pull off something similar to what Vladimir Putin did in Ukraine and annex a part of the DRC, or at least control it? Or is the international community strongly united to force the Rwandese out? So again, I'd love to be optimistic, but I think this is a long drawn-out process. And because of the economies of violence, the volume of billions and billions of dollars of resources and gold and coltan and rare minerals in that area, it's very difficult to see a solution to this crisis, particularly when the countries that have armies there are also engaged in exploitation and extraction of those minerals, including the DRC army. Many of the DRC army sergeants, lieutenants have not been paid for many months. So they're also involved in backhand trading with these rebel groups. So it's a very difficult and complex situation.
Very interesting. I want to hear from Natalia Torrent, who's joining us from North Kivu. But before I do that, and I want to let go of Professor. Professor, there is a joint summit of the Southern African Development Community and the East Africa Community, EAC, that we, of course, expect will be held on Friday and on Saturday on the conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. What I want to bring to our attention now, and I want to hear your words on this, is that this follows an argument between the chairman of SADC, President Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, and EAC DRC chairperson, our own president, William Ruto. And so far, they say Samia Suluhu, the president of Tanzania, deliberately and graciously chose to have this particular summit held in Dar es Salaam. I just want to hear your analysis on this particular summit. Don't you think it's a step forward? Because you said that you do not think, in your wisdom, that Kagame would be willing to have such a lengthy conversation or any kind of conversation with, Tshisekedi at this point in time. Perhaps if you could clarify, do you think this is a right direction for the continent?
So if having a diplomatic meeting and have Tshisekedi and Kagame shake hands in front of cameras and say they have met, if that's what we would consider to be success, then I guess a photo shoot for these two presidents could be considered success. But I think ultimately it will be what we actually see on the ground. In other words, will the M23, for example, give up the territory they already acquired in Goma? Because right now they're already planning to advance on Bukavu and probably go all the way to Kinshasa the way they did with the First Congo War to remove, President Mobutu. They might be looking to do a similar thing with, President Tshisekedi. And it's very possible that this could happen depending on whether the Ugandans are on board with Kagame and what the other regional players, will do. I must also add that, again, with the complexities of this, meeting and summit, even though Tshisekedi and Kagame meet, there seems to be a lot of mutual suspicion and distrust between them. And I'd really be looking at two countries here who are members of SADC that don't have troops on the ground. This is Zambia, that has a border with the DRC, and Angola. We know that Angola was critical in supporting the Kabila regime when Rwanda tried in the Second Congo War to remove Kabila. Now, will Angola be willing to intervene and send troops on the ground? Angolan troops have been fighting UNITA for over 40 years. These are really battle-hardened troops. So that's another angle to think about. Also, will the Zambians come on board? So the diplomacy is there. The photo, shoots are good on the ground. But ultimately, Rwanda will not leave the DRC until it's sure that the FDLR has been removed, that threat of the former Interahamwe has been removed. But another facet of this will be, does Rwanda really want to give up the $1 billion worth of gold that it extracts from the DRC every year? Will Rwanda be willing to give that up? Or will it continue to use the pretext of the pretext of the Interahamwe, the FDLR in the Eastern DRC, as a reason to continue this very interventionist foreign policy within the DRC? And we also know that Kinshasa has very limited weak control over the Eastern Great Lakes. And this goes back to the history of the Mobutu era, when he deliberately made sure the DRC army was weak. A lot of those issues are now catching up with the current Tshisekedi regime. He has a lot of domestic pressure to not to give in to the Rwandese. But the dilemma here is the DRC army is just not strong enough to confront these rebel militia and even to take on the Rwandese in that very far region of the Eastern Congo. The DRC is the second largest country in Africa. So this is one big country, and I'm not sure Kinshasa has control over that eastern part of the DRC, which is why Rwanda can continue to do what it does in that region.
Very interesting analysis. Thank you so much for your time, Professor David Monda, who is a political scientist in the University of New York, for joining us virtually all the way from New York. And that is it for Professor. We are letting him go, and he has other engagements, but I'll still be here with Natalia Torrent, who is the MSF Chief of Programs, North Kivu, and also Dr. Edgar Githua, who is the International Affairs and Security Analyst. We have to get to understanding this even deeper after this break.